welcome to It's Your Time You're Wasting with me, David Didow, and the elegant, the dapper, the wonderful Martin Robinson. I ran out of epithets to describe you there, Martin. I'm sorry.
Superlatives. Superlatives.
Yes, I did. I don't think I was using some superlatives as much as just adjectives, but
Yeah.
never mind. We are where we are. This week, we're talking about what it is to be British. We're going to talk about a couple of reports and surveys and bits and pieces that have come out recently. And we're going to be addressing the question, are we, Martin, an island of strangers?
And don't forget to like and subscribe
Like and
and
subscribe, do the
follow.
thing with, yeah, all of that stuff. So, Martin, before we get into this, obviously a real sort of signifier of belonging for you is hanging behind you on the wall. What on earth's going on there?
Yes, well, Tottenham actually won something yesterday, and I've had a sleepless night of joy, if you see what I mean.
I'll bet
That could
you
be
have.
expressed differently. But yeah, we won something finally after 17 years and 41 years from last time we won something in Europe as well. So it's a wonderful day to be a Tottenham fan.
Well done, Martin.
Well,
I know.
it's all down to
Yeah,
me.
it's all down to you, and
I
I'm
wore
sure
my dark blue underwear, which
your
always
lucky pants.
that's my lucky pants.
How
Yes.
long have you had those, Martin?
Well, they keep being updated every so often.
Oh, okay, okay.
Thankfully.
So are they like Trigger's broom
Yeah, that
for the
sort of
shifty
thing. Yeah.
pieces?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
yeah,
I
they
like
are.
that. Yeah.
They are. Okay.
Hmm.
Right. Okay. Well, enough about Tottenham Hotspur. And
But it
so,
is about belonging. I quite like that link actually.
yeah, I know it was
Belonging
quite.
to a
I
tribe,
was quite
belonging.
pleased with my segue there.
Yeah. Yeah. We go. Well, keep going.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're going to be wading into the murky waters of cultural cohesion and curriculum design, we're going to think about whether schools are teaching the right kind of knowledge that helps young people feel connected to the place where they live. We're going to think about everyone's favourite American academic, E.D. Hirsch Jr., who we've interviewed before, Martin.
We did, yes, and it's available on our YouTube channel. And
I remember him saying. I remember Don Hirsch saying he wasn't used to the quality of interview that we
I know
gave him.
extraordinarily so that we're the top of interviewers of E.D.
The
Hirsch.
best interview he's ever had. So
Yes,
if you want to experience that, we haven't interviewed Matthew Arnold though, have we?
no, he unfortunately died before we could get round to it.
Just it was so close. R.H. Tawney as well. Haven't interviewed him. We have interviewed, or you've interviewed Professor Michael Young,
Yeah,
who we're also going to reference as we go through.
and
And
that's
we're going to do.
also available on our YouTube channel.
Yes, it is. We'll with the show notes, we will provide links to those kinds of things. Sophisticated YouTubers can sort of point to areas of the screen and those links happen, but we're
Mhm.
not that kind of YouTuber, are we, Martin?
Well, when you get to the end of our this
Yeah, you have to wait.
program,
You have to wait.
you have to wade all the way through it, and it
Yeah.
will be there.
So cultural literacy it's a kind of glue, it's a shared bank of references and values and stories that bind idealist society together. But Martin, the question we're asking is the glue holding? Or are we becoming more like a fragmented archipelago than a unified island?
Archipelago,
Archipelago?
archipelago.
Archipelago?
Yeah,
Tomato,
archipelago. I quite
tomato,
like
or have I just got it wrong?
archipelago. Certain archipelago. Let's go with that. Yeah,
Yeah.
we need some cultural glue here on pronunciation.
Right. Yeah, I know. It's one of those words where I'm always a little bit on the back foot about how I've said it. The first time I came across it, believe it or not, was as a youngster, I think a 14-year-old, reading Solzhenitsyn, which I didn't know
Of
how to
course.
say either. Yeah, I was a huge fan of Russian literature as a young teenager, and yeah, I went straight from Ivan Denisovich into the Gulag Archi-
Well,
archipelago. Still
you see,
not
you should
sure.
have been reading English literature rather
I
than Russian
should.
literature. That's where
Had
you
I
went
done
wrong.
that, I
Yeah,
would have known how to pronounce
yeah.
the
And I
word.
wonder if there's someone called Archipelgo out there who perhaps would have
No
a
doubt.
view on this.
Archie, if you're called Archipelago, get in touch. Tell us what it's like. Maybe you're Archipelago.
Yeah,
I
you
don't
know.
know. Yeah. Anyway, we'd love to hear from you, Archie. But before we get into that, Martin, what is cultural literacy? Does it still matter?
Yeah. This is something we do cover in that interview quite a lot, actually, because do we all need to know the same stuff? I think that's an essential question, especially in certain subjects. And I think certain subjects come under the microscope more than others. And in particular, history being a biggie, and
Yeah.
also English literature, what you read, and that sort of glue. I would include the rest of the arts and humanities in the picture, but these subjects become less and less important the further we go into our schooling because they become optional. So it's probably
Yeah.
English literature that carries the flag for most people all the way through, isn't it?
I guess that's true. I guess that's true. And I think maybe tell me what you think about this, Martin, because obviously, it's important to have shared knowledge in subjects like mathematics and science. There's just less argument about what those things should be. There's nobody saying, let's take out square roots, let's not do algebra. Osmosis has had its day. We're not going to bother with that anymore. There's a broader agreement about what needs to be included.
Yeah, it's. I think when we talk about literature and art in this country, and then number one is
Yeah.
Shakespeare. I think
Shakespeare,
Shakespeare is
yeah.
the one they would all say we all must study.
Well, Shakespeare, the only named author in the English national curriculum
Mm.
currently.
Yeah,
That might change. But yeah, there is a requirement that children encounter at least two Shakespeare plays during their time at school.
which isn't necessarily a great coverage of Shakespeare, or indeed the right way to teach Shakespeare. But that's another
No,
thing entirely.
that's
But
another question. But no, but interesting that he is the only named author at the time. So obviously, E.D. Hirsch is the guy that coined the phrase cultural capital. What does he mean
cultural
by
literacy. I'm going to cultural literacy,
Sorry,
cultural capital, another thing altogether.
that's
But
bored
yeah,
you. Yeah, apologies. Yeah, I got confused there. Sorry. Yeah, so he talks about cultural literacy. Can you remind everyone what cultural literacy is?
well, if get his book out, which is over there
Go
on
on.
my shelf, which I can't quite reach, so I don't want to clamber over the mess that is my
Oh,
spare
really?
room.
But it looks so ordered to the viewer.
It's
But what
chaotic.
you're saying is it's an illusion, Martin.
It's got all the stuff from my dearly departed mother's house in here in boxes, and
Okay. Oh,
I've got an
yeah,
excuse. So,
yeah,
but cultural literacy, he did put it. Don't worry, he put it down to 5,000 words or things that we should all, in order to be an American. And
yeah,
I think it's quite different, perhaps, in America because it's a bigger country. The issue, and also its education system is far more splintered than even ours
yeah.
is now. Um, but what sort of shared knowledge he decided to talk about? I think it was the New York Times or
It
the
was the New
Washington
York
Post.
Times.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, what sort of background knowledge you would need if you were reading
yeah.
the
And
New
there's some
York
quite
Times?
interesting things. As I just from memory, there's things references to things like Whistler's mother.
Yeah, and
That's
Brer
something.
Rabbit,
Or pardon.
Brer Rabbit.
Brer Rabbit. I remember as well jumping out at me the phrase, you cannot serve God and mammon. That
Yeah,
was on the list. Things, so all sorts of bits of cultural artifacts from all sorts of different sources. There were scientific words, there were figures from history, there were geographical terms, and there were literary references and artistic references, all neatly put into alphabetical order and so his his curriculum that's evolved from that over the years is an attempt to weave those things into a meaningful and coherent network.
yeah, and it's encountered number of opposition because
Yeah,
also of in terms of um, decolonization of the curriculum and things like that have come along and
yeah,
sort of said this is a white man's curriculum, whatever. But basically, the idea is to read a copy of the New York Times. You need to have certain amount of background knowledge because certain things are taken for granted by the New York Times that you would know
yeah,
if you read this, and that's would even go into the sports pages about baseball and all sorts of other things, of
for
course.
sure. Yeah,
Um, Michael Young, powerful knowledge, slightly different idea, but he
mm,
talks about the knowledge that people should know that they wouldn't necessarily learn at home. It's not
yeah,
folk knowledge. It's a certain formality about it. Certainly in the sciences and everything else.
yeah.
I'm not sure if it works so well in the arts, but
No,
that's
he talks about knowledge that you can use to make generalizations, and you can think like if this applies here, it should also apply there. That
yeah,
kind of stuff. And as you say, things which are sometimes counterintuitive. So, various sort of scientific principles are often run contrary to our lived experience in terms of why they might be happening. But also things like, ideas that we get just by looking at the world around us. So, the landscape, that's always been like that, except it hasn't.
no.
It's changed. It's been different, and the idea of those sorts of encountering knowledge to explain those sorts of concepts, I think, is what he'd include under his banner of powerful knowledge, isn't it?
Yeah, and in our curriculum, and I'm calling it our curriculum, the English national curriculum. Of course, the one theorist, cultural theorist that is quoted right at the beginning of the national curriculum is Matthew Arnold, and
Yeah,
we talk about the best that has been thought and said as the guiding principle behind what should be
yeah,
in our
indeed.
curriculum.
Yeah, yeah. Um, an ex-head of HMI, Martin, an ex-chief inspector.
Yes, well, the first,
Was he the first?
I think so. Yeah,
Okay, I'm not sure if he was. I'm not sure if that's
you should
correct that he was
get your
actually the
history
first.
book out.
He was certainly early on. Yeah, and he spent years visiting schools and sort of despairing, pulling his hair out. You can read his reports, which are quite entertaining reading, a lot of them, and where he sort of goes around going, "Blimey hell, kids don't know this stuff. It's wild, it's crazy," and things which things have changed, obviously, maybe not for the better, as we will get to later on in the show. So let's sort of think about. So that's the sort of framework that we need. So the first of the reports that we're going to look at is one that has been published by Policy Exchange. Policy Exchange set up by David Cameron and
I
that
think it
sort
was
of
Michael Gove. I think it was
Michael
Michael
Gove,
Gove. Yeah.
those sorts of guys. So definitely right leaning historically, and they've put out a report called Lessons from the Past, where they've looked at the history curriculum.
Yeah, and they're looking at things that are taught actually in schools
Yeah,
in England, and whether they would approve of it or not. I suppose what are the
what's top
sorts
of the
of things?
pops in?
Top of the pops, I think, is the Atlantic slave trade. At the
Yeah,
bottom, I think we get so most students in England are taught about the Atlantic slave trade, as you know, so as part of our cultural glue, if you like, is most people in our schools will be learning about the Atlantic slave trade. Now, from
yeah,
a conservative point of view, it's interesting down the bottom of the list of things that so fewer students learn about things like Agincourt and Trafalgar,
and Waterloo.
Waterloo, because we have the station. Funnily enough, when I was
We
teaching,
have
I
the
remember
station, we have the songs.
we do,
Uh,
well,
maybe
that's
nobody
yes.
knows what's going on with them.
When
And Waterloo, huge cultural reference point because it's been used to name later cultural events like the Peterloo massacre.
yeah,
That all stems from a shared knowledge of Waterloo.
and also Waterloo Station.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
But I remember teaching about something or other. I was talking to students in my East London classroom and mentioned Trafalgar Square.
Yeah.
And some of the students in East London didn't know anything about Trafalgar Square, where it was, who was on top of that long column for those that did know about it, and all
Yeah.
sorts of things. And that was in the 90s, and I was a bit shocked, I must say, about the lack of that cultural knowledge about your town, but not even thinking that London is part of the same place, which I can understand why people might think that. But what should we know in history to make us English, to make us British?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I mean, from a background as a English teacher, one of the things that I've uh, regularly encountered is because obviously we teach Shakespeare plays, we teach Victorian novels, and it's not uncommon for students to be unclear about whether Elizabeth precedes or comes after Victoria. That's not
Elizabeth,
secure.
which Elizabeth?
Well, quite. So when we're talking about Elizabethan and Victorian, that's something that needs to be taught. That needs to be something that's clarified, and it isn't something that you can take for granted. So, one of a question, an open question, is: would it be useful for all young people to have a basic working knowledge of the chronology of British history?
Right. And chronology is a big issue in terms of, do you learn it chronologically?
Right. Well, there's a certain sense to that, isn't there?
There is, except that you can therefore forget everything about the Iron Age by the time you get round. If
Yeah,
you
it
see what I
depends how
mean.
you do it. Yeah,
It's
if
well,
you're,
it is a linear. This comes
yeah,
down to curriculum design, of whether
yeah,
curriculum design is in fact linear, which isn't
yeah,
necessarily true. So
no,
if you learn something in a linear way, you tend to forget about things that were early on in that linear cycle. Perhaps cycle, a kind
yeah.
of linear cycle. Can you have a linear? I don't think you can. Anyway,
No, that sounds oxymoronic.
it did completely. Yeah, I knew what I was trying to say, but I didn't
Yes.
say it. But there you go.
Um, and they're particularly critical about GCSE and A level, aren't they?
Which one? The policy
The
exchange. Yeah.
the policy
Sorry.
exchange report.
That's right.
Yeah, the thing we've been talking about, Martin. I don't know.
you,
It's
you,
probably going
you
back
threw
about
me there.
5 minutes. So
Yeah, I think that they're more happy with Key Stage 3, which they think
yeah,
has a certain cohesion about it. I think GCSE, for a start with history, if you'll say that history is part of cultural cohesion, and again, we might doubt this later on in our discussion, so we might question that. But let's say it is,
yeah,
then why do you give up teaching it to some students at 14? Because they can choose not to do it. So they can
yeah.
choose not to be culturally cohesed into,
Well,
so there
yeah,
is that. And then if they do carry on, it tends to, for the majority of students, something like 60%, to become a
yeah.
diet of medicine, Nazis, and Tudors.
Yeah, the history of medicine's kind of a strange one, isn't it? Up until quite recently, there were lots of schools doing the history of the American West, which struck me as a sort of interesting thing to want to include.
Well, it's interesting as well that a lot of what we teach here is about, in terms of race relations,
Yeah,
is about race relations in America. So it's more
yeah,
likely
exactly.
to "I have a dream" speech and things like that.
And
Um,
Rosa Parks and
yeah. So rather than issues that have happened in this country, which
yeah,
I think would make far more sense.
well, yeah. I mean, and that's. I remember some years ago reading why I've stopped talking to white people about race. Renee Edo, I can't remember her name, to my shame, but she talks about that fact there that the English people have this sense of, yeah, racism, something that happens in America. We
Hmm.
don't do that over here. Probably we're getting better at it. There seems to be a lot more of it about in the last few years, as things lurch to the right post Brexit. But interestingly, I think my eldest daughter's experience, who did both GCSE and A level history, was a hell of a lot of time on the tutors, uh,
Hmm.
uh, but in both courses.
Hmm.
And so, really, really interesting that the Tudors have been identified as such a pivotal part of British history, and then Nazi Germany and the events around the Second World War picked out again as hugely important to studying history in Britain, or at
Yeah,
least in England.
well, the rise of Hitler and things like that aren't necessarily what's happened here, of course. I mean, where the little boats who went over the channel a couple of days ago, to for the 85th anniversary of Dunkirk, it is something that is in the national psyche, one could say, so perhaps shouldn't be forgotten. The same thing with
The Dunkirk spirit,
the
Martin.
Dunkirk spirit, yeah, and VE Day as well as recently, saying we're trying to sort of make certain elements of our history into national events. Um, and these could be cultural glue.
I like their recommend one of their recommendations, which is the idea of introducing a survey paper as part of how children are assessed in their how well they've learned history or how well they've been taught history. And by so a survey curriculum for anyone who's not sure is essentially to do a fairly brisk trot through the whole breadth. And so they're recommending that this element of GCSE would be the highlights of British history from 1066 to 1989.
Mm. And of course, in that, you will miss out most of history, most of the things that have happened. But I mean, you're going to have to balance these things. It is very difficult. What about other
Yeah, I mean, there's a
subjects?
thousand years there.
Do other subjects come into it? Do we have the cultural glue of what we learn in STEM subjects? It's funny when people say STEM, isn't it? Because we tend not to teach technology and engineering. It's basically
No,
science and math, so it should be S and
yeah,
M.
yeah,
S and
bit of
M, not
technology
STEM.
and S&M. Okay, let's see if that sticks, Martin. It could be catchy.
I think it's been done before. Um,
Yeah, I think
but
it might
anyway,
mean
we don't teach much technology now and engineering
no,
hardly at
no.
all. But
So yeah, STEM. Little bit of a false flag maybe, but certainly maths and science. No one can argue there's not enough of that being taught, can they?
no, but and we also said it's pretty similar what perhaps is taught
Yeah.
in those subjects. Uh,
But
did you ever?
I've argued for a long time that I am very much in favour of a survey curriculum for English literature, and so a lot of the curriculum work I've done, particularly around Key Stage 3, is to try and give students an experience of a broad sweep of what English literature is, where it came from, the things that it's encountered along the way, how it's changed, why it is
Right.
the way it is at various points. I
Yeah,
really like that idea.
I think there's a lot to be said about that in terms of the relationship between breadth and depth and
Yeah.
what what that would look like in different subjects is worth a discussion. Did you ever read Our Island Story when you were
No,
younger?
I mean I'm aware of it, and I do remember it getting reissued by Civitas 20
And it
years
had a
ago.
forward by Gove in it, I think. I think it was a bit like it.
Yeah, yeah, it got a bit of the usual people being cross with it, but it's been around a long, long time, wasn't it? Published in something like 1905.
Yeah, it's part of our island story itself, perhaps. It's
I
certainly
think.
an old tome, and I remember reading it, and particularly to my daughter when she was much younger. I thought, oh, this would be fun because it's a good way for me to find out a bit about our island story as well. But
Mm.
though I was brought up on R.J. Unstead books, which were really good, I remember as a kid. But that's by the by. But a lot of what we read in our island story together was at the beginning. It was quite mythological, Gog and
Yeah.
Magog, and
Does it have Brutus in?
well, Brutus. Which two? Which two? Which Brutus? Sorry.
The Brutus who, according to legend, founded Britain.
Oh, him. No, it must
No.
have done. It must have done. I just
Okay.
whether I remember it or not is
Right, right, right.
another matter. It's clearly that I don't. But I think it had Arthur in it and lots of other
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah,
mythological things. So,
Arthur, Alfred, all of the.
well, Alfred
I've got
existed, didn't he? And Arthur didn't.
Alfred did exist, but he is
He burnt the
as
cakes.
much a figure of legend as he is a figure of history. I think it's probably fair to say.
Oh, okay.
Well, a lot of the stories, like burning the cakes, Probably not true.
I've there's a place in Wantage in Oxfordshire that says this is where he burnt the cakes.
Right.
So it
Okay.
must be
Well,
true.
sorry, Wantage. Yeah. So I live in the West Country, and yeah, it's definitely Alfred territory round here. There's lots of places that sort of claim to be where he hid out in the swamps around Glastonbury and Wedmore, where they all think he probably burnt the cakes round by there away. But
Right. But aren't you more Arthurian as well? You get a bit further towards Cornwall, I suppose.
wow, Arthur, isn't that sort of more Cornish? I
Yeah,
don't
I was just
know,
saying. Yeah, yeah,
Tintagel, and
yeah.
that's a long way from where I live, Martin. I'm
Yes, it
afraid.
is a long way, especially if
Yeah,
you're driving.
we don't like people from around those parts.
They do. They do their. Oh, you don't mind scones or scones where you are, I suppose, where
Do you
the
know?
cream is and
Yeah.
not.
What's
You see,
the fastest cake in the world, Martin?
tell me,
Scone.
scone. Yeah. And
Sorry. Yeah.
talking of a
Okay. Tell
country.
us about Henrietta Marshall's Our Island Story.
Well, no, I was
What?
going to say we can't even get a story together about when to put the cream on first or the jam on first on bloody scone. You know, let alone how to
Well,
pronounce scone.
it's a thing we love to argue about. I'm very much cream first, jam on top. Any other choice is wrong.
I think you're right.
Well, there you are. Good.
So we're
Well,
united in this, and we've probably lost about 20 viewers.
well, we can't afford that. We only have 23. Um,
We're doing all right. We're doing all right.
yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
Come on. What? Tell it. What?
well, no,
Well,
I just
I haven't
as
read Our Island Story.
no, but
What
the reason it was brought in by Gove particularly and people like that is to say we need to have some sort of unifying narrative of the history of our country, of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and to have, you know, it's not just kings and queens. There's more to the story than that. Now, of course, being 1905, it's a very dated story and a
it is.
very dated
Hence,
vision.
hence the reissue at the. I think it must have been 100 years, mustn't it? 2005 when they reissued it.
But the it was a rewrite you're talking about, or
Mm.
the
Yeah, the
reissue.
Civitas one.
So there's a rewrite that Civitas did, was it, or was it
Yeah,
just
yeah.
a
Well, I
reprint?
mean, I don't. Not having read either of them,
Right.
I
Okay.
can't tell you with any authority about to what extent it was rewritten. But it's a good question. Do we need a modern rewrite?
Or do we need our island story, or do we need a whole and a whole vision of perhaps the Western canon of history and all the sort of flows and influxes of Western history that some people say, you know, needs
Hmm.
to be put out there, and other people say we know we need a worldwide view of history, and we need to look at
Yeah.
history as a whole,
Well,
not
there's
just
been
a national story, but as
been
an
a few good.
international,
Sorry, Martin.
worldwide story.
Thought you'd finished then, but apologies. Yeah, there's been a few good attempts to reclaim some of this territory. There was David Olshugo's book, Black and British, A Forgotten History, where he's talking about the fact that people who aren't white have been part of our island story for quite a long time and had significant roles to play. And then, have you read? I thought it was a cracking book, Empire Lands by
Hmm.
Safan Sanghera. Have you come across
I've
that?
I've I've dipped in, as they say.
Yeah, it was really good. And what I really liked about his take is he's writing as a British Asian, and he's writing about the concept of British Empire, and he talks quite openly about the fact that as a British Asian, if you are in any way critical of Britain, British Empire, that kind of thing, then that there's a certain sort of person who's like, well, you should be a bit more grateful, and what did the empire's done marvelous things for India and all this sort of thing, and he's coming at his story through a lens of, look, I love loads of things about Britain. I think it's I'm grateful to be British. I still think it's appropriate to be critical of a lot of the things that happened in our empire story in particular. and we shouldn't marginalise those. We should acknowledge them, and we can only be the richer for doing so.
But that
I
could be
really like
the it's also the Oliver Cromwell view of history, or a portrait painting at least, warts and all.
that.
Should we teach empire warts and all, or should we just teach empire as a bad thing overall, or a good thing overall? And there are
Well, we
people on
definitely
all
shouldn't
sides
teach
of
it as
that.
a good thing overall, should we?
Well, some people would think, that it becomes very political, and then if you're going to try and represent every man or
Yeah.
every person, should I say, um, there you go. Straight away with the word every man. I don't represent every man, every
No.
person. Um, how are you going to represent every view in the country on these issues? Or should schools
Ah,
teach
okay.
teach a way through the centre and sort of become very centrist in their
That's
approach? Because these things are
that's
political, no?
yeah, that's not the same, is it? Because teaching every view isn't teaching history. So if we were to teach that the British Empire was wholly good, that isn't history. That would be fantasy.
And if we taught it's wholly bad, but then again, there is good on all sides. The sort of Donald Trump quote of looking at a rally with the pro Nazis and the Antifa sort of coming up and saying there's good on all sides or something like that. People
Well,
find these things very tense, very
well, they
difficult.
might find them tense, but had arguably, if they had possessed more factual knowledge that was agreed, even if unwillingly, that might be a better grounds for discussion.
Yeah, and in a busy curriculum with hardly any space for certain subjects, history is one that does take up less room than English.
For sure.
Um, what do you teach? What do you leave out? Is
Well,
is learning English a way of binding society together? The
learning
language,
English subjects, the language.
the language for obviously for those who don't speak English at all, who are
Yeah,
resident here, there's an argument they should learn to speak English to become
yeah,
resident, to be resident. But
yeah,
also in terms of cultural knowledge, we're looking at cultural glue. Is
yeah,
learning English, and is that standard English? What do we mean by English? Tell
yeah.
me.
So, what do I think everyone should speak standard English?
Well, what is the background cultural glue of English? Is it
Yeah,
everyone speaking their own native dialect? You know,
yeah.
Cornwall,
Well, one of the things, sure. Yeah, Cornish people should all learn and be assessed
Cornish.
on Cornish, shouldn't they? That would bind them together in their rural poverty a bit better. Uh,
I'm going to
no,
leave you West
so,
Country people to have your own arguments. I'm not getting involved in that.
yeah, fine. So it's interesting, isn't it, when you watch early TV and we listen to the received pronunciation of broadcasters from the 50s, nobody speaks like that anymore. And it's so those sorts of things. I mean, obviously, people spoke differently again in the past, but we don't have the same kind of records of that. And so when we sort of put lines in the sand and say this is correct grammar and this is standard English, and everybody should conform to these expectations, that they're built on shifting sands. That language changes, and I think that our view of language should always accommodate that. And so I think though that if we are ambitious for children to be academically successful, and of course we are, then they need to be fluent in the language of academic success. And so that then means it becomes incumbent upon teachers, upon schools to give children access to the language of academic success. And
Okay,
some
but is
children,
this language of academic success, is that just another way of saying middle class received pronunciation, grammarian rules?
well, no, I don't think it is. I think it's the language in which exam papers are written and assessed.
By middle class people generally?
I, I don't know if anyone's done a survey of the of
I bet
the.
they. I bet it pretty much comes out that
Yeah,
way.
they pretty much. I bet you're pretty much right that there are definitely assumptions made every year, we haven't had the English language papers this year for GCSE, but every year there's a middle class tariff where the papers will be about, I don't know, skiing holidays or something like that, which various swathes of the country are cut off from and have no access to in terms of their own experience, and therefore are arguably likely to do less well as a result. And I think the English language GCSE is, I've said it before, the most iniquitous of all of the GCSEs that our children currently sit, and it's very much built upon a grounds of that if you have a shared knowledge, a shared general knowledge, you are likely to be able to do better on that paper than if you don't. So how do you teach it? It certainly does open up some debates around that.
This brings me to I was looking through YouTube the other day, as one does,
Doom scrolling, Martin.
doom scrolling, and came across a YouTuber called Eman RTM,
We
and
love Eman RTM.
and I shared it with you, and said, here we go.
Yeah, I
This is
quickly
hilarious
became
stuff.
obsessed.
The power of ignorance, we call it. It's a great YouTube channel, and it just keep teachers amused for years, I think. What does he do?
Yeah.
Tell us what he does.
He goes out and vox
Emmanuel,
pops
his
people.
name is, yeah.
Emmanuel, yeah, he goes out into the street and he asks people general knowledge questions. Mainly, most of it's in Birmingham. He's obviously lives in Birmingham, and so I recognise lots of landmarks and um, bits of the city and that he's in. And he'll ask people basic general knowledge questions, sometimes as simple as what's the capital of the United Kingdom, what's two times two, and very often the people who ask these questions are stumped. And there's some lovely examples of that. We'll put a link to some of our favourites that you can go and browse afterwards. Sometimes he asks some sort of sneaky questions and things which I think are that people, even if they are generally well educated, might struggle to answer. But by and large, it's kind of shocking, isn't it? How common it would appear to be that people don't seem to know anything at all.
Yeah, I don't think it's shocking. I think it's more funny. The level of ignorance. I mean,
I don't know. I feel a bit bad at laughing at some of these people.
well, this is the odd thing. I think he's got such a nice way
Yeah, he has.
that actually he doesn't actually laugh at. He does do this double look at the camera thing,
Yeah,
which is
but then if you haven't seen it, he'll say things to people like, "Let's role play a bit, Martin here." So,
oh no,
Martin, what's the capital city of Italy?
Athens,
And then he'll go,
and then but they will as well. They'll look into the camera.
they'll both look at the camera. And some of them, sometimes I'll be like, "Why are you looking at the camera?"
So it's miles and miles and miles of enjoyment and fun,
Yeah,
but also there is
I've wasted a
interesting
few hours, I'm
that there
afraid.
were areas of the country. I will say he came down to Greenwich at one point, and it became an episode where most people seem to know most things
Yeah,
that he was asking. Now, obviously, he's editing stuff, he's doing all sorts of other
of
things,
course.
so there could be hundreds of
Well, I
people
think,
who are edited who don't quite get into the edit for whatever reason. But it's
yeah,
interesting how the journeys around the country sort of perhaps change things.
it feels fairly even-handed because he definitely, in every one I've seen, he includes a few people that kind of, are able to answer and are almost served up as a contrast. And he'll be like, "Oh, yeah," and he'll be impressed that. And one of the things that I've tended to notice is that if somebody can answer one question right, they can probably answer them all.
Hmm. Yeah,
That these
it's
things seem
certainly
to
interesting.
correlate.
It's certainly interesting how people come across, and whether they give permission for him to put them out there or not, I don't know. So I don't know the ethics behind it, but
I'm sure there's no ethics agreement being signed here.
it's have a look. But it comes interesting about the geography of our country
Right.
and our country's ignorance, if you like, an ignorance map, perhaps we could look at.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
we could probably get him. Let's hook him up with Luke Trill from More in Common, and they could probably work together quite productively.
well, yeah. So talking about more in common, we've got Luke Trill who does a lot of work with them.
Used to work for
Put
Ofsted, Luke.
He used to, yes,
Yeah.
he used to. Um, he did a survey about strangers in the UK, um, strangers in their own country, about
Yeah,
people in
and
the
how
UK,
education and geography and class seem to intersect.
and he, I think it was quite an extensive survey, about 13,000
Yeah,
Britons,
that's right.
and they came up with about 50% of people feel disconnected from society, so do feel like strangers
Yeah,
in.
44% saying that they agreed with the idea that sometimes they feel like strangers in their own country.
And what was the driving force? Was it what they learnt at school? No, not generally.
No. More so clearly, how economically secure they felt seemed to be significant.
And this comes down to what, of course, a lot of our expectations as teachers, or certainly as educationalists, looking at where education success is. It generally follows social class, where
Well,
and
let's come back to that in a moment because we're also going to have a look at a Sutton Trust report, which slightly challenges that, doesn't it?
I think so. But
Yeah.
but but certainly that's the general feeling people get. So are poorer people more likely to feel alienated by the society in
Yeah.
which they're in, and those who are well off in the society tend to think it's more their home, because they do feel
Mm,
at home here. More so, they can actually enjoy the fruits of their labor by going out to take part in the society in which they find themselves, like me
yeah,
going to a football match or the theatre or the opera, as I did all that this week.
as you tend to do. Yeah.
Yes.
I haven't done any of those things this week, Martin.
Well, that's because you don't live
Um,
in London, you see.
no, exactly. Exactly. It is partly for that reason. Yeah, for sure. So, I've got this maybe completely erroneous feeling that in our past, communities where there was a lot of disadvantage and poverty, there was a feeling of we're all in it together, and I have that stereotyped vision of people sort of brushing the front steps of their terraced houses, and everybody working in the same factory or the same mine or whatever it was, and there being a real sense of social cohesion, and that
Or the
maybe
Blitz,
that's
the Blitz spirit in the war.
yeah, yeah, that kind of thing. And there's I remember years ago I worked at a school in Weston-super-Mare, um, uh, so part of a seaside town, about 15 miles from Bristol, and people who don't live in Weston-super-Mare refer to it as Western Super Nightmare or Heroin on Sea. I think it's sometimes lovingly referred to as well. And I remember working when I worked at this secondary school in Weston. Um, I the school that I worked at was on the estate, the poorest estate in the town, and this estate was made up of some really quite nice Victorian housing stock. You know, sort of from the outside, it looked like there was a certain level of affluence, but if you walked around, if you got a sense of the lives that people lived in this community, it was very, very atomized. That lots of people were shipped in to drug rehabilitation centres and they didn't know anybody else, and there was this really tangible sense of disconnection that was new to me at the time being there. You know, where I grew up, I didn't grow up wealthy. I grew up in Smethwick in Birmingham, and there was a sense of yeah, we've all got nothing, and it's fine. And I could envy, people having skateboards when I didn't. But essentially, I was out there playing with the same people, and everyone I knew was broadly similar. And this struck me as very, very different experience. And I wonder, one of the statistics from this More in Common report is that 66% of people who feel they're struggling financially feel also disconnected, and that compares to 37% of those who feel financially comfortable.
Yeah, so they More in Common, alongside Citizens UK and the UCL, University College London, have
Yeah.
launched the This Place Matters initiative, which is aiming to provide a
Yeah.
blueprint for effective cohesion policies and amplify grassroots efforts to strengthen community bonds. So it's something beyond just schooling. I think that's something we need to say. But
Yeah.
there is evidence in their survey that those with less formal education are more likely to say the system of the country is rigged against them. They feel that
Yeah.
the whole the whole of society is rigged against them. So,
Do they say, have they looked at what the political affiliations of those people are? Are they more likely to be reform supporters, Martin?
and Brexit voters, I do not know,
Right. I'm
and
sure. I'm sure they will know that, won't they? And
they
it seems
I don't know. It might be in
seems
it might be in the
plausible, doesn't
survey.
it?
It might be in the survey. We need to look back over it. Perhaps
Yeah.
I'll link to it and people can look for themselves.
Absolutely.
But that's the impression one might get. By the way, the Blitz spirit, which is talking about the winners writing history, apparently evidence at the time was there was a lot of people who weren't partaking in the Blitz spirit and were undermining, and there was crime going on and lots of other
Yeah.
things. So
Yeah.
is it
Black marketeering rife.
yeah,
Yeah.
so not everyone was pulling in the same direction. So whether these things about community cohesion is always
Yeah.
looking back over what it used to be like when we
Of course.
all pulled together might be a different thing altogether.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
I
As I
think
said, maybe a fantasy.
maybe not. This is for historians to look into. Um, there's another report which
Yeah.
is the Sutton Trust, and I find this absolutely fascinating because
It's about
generally,
opportunity index, isn't it?
yeah, it kind of undermines the argument I just gave earlier, which
Mm.
was about social position in society. So those poorer people do worse at school,
Yeah.
which is a sort of truism, but
Sort of.
yeah, but
Yeah.
this is what's excellent
Geography
about
matters.
this
That's
report that
the
the Sutton
finding,
Trust
isn't it?
have done, and they've looked at free school meal pupils
Yeah.
geographically, how they perform at GCSE, etc. And their finding is quite extraordinary that if you're a poor person basing it on free school meals in East Ham in London, you're doing far better than a free school meal student in parts of Newcastle. I mean, it's extraordinary.
So, for anyone who's not been to East Ham, Martin, what's it like there?
What's it like? It's got high levels of deprivation. It is an East London, East London community of the old sense of the old school. It
It's a
it
very poor
does have
borough.
it's in Newham Borough.
Yeah.
It's obviously rows and rows of Victorian housing and also council housing and various other sort of social housing in the area. It's cut off from other parts of London in that it's this whole thing about East London being very different to West London, but it's a place that is not on the tourist trail, shall we say that,
No.
to put it politely. Though I used to live very near it, living in Leytonstone, Leighton, Stratford. So Stratford, I lived in Stratford, very close to it, and Walthamstow. All these lovely areas
Yeah.
of East London that I've lived in. Um,
Was this when you were in the boy band E17, Martin?
that's right. It's amazing how well I've kept
Yeah.
my looks, really.
At least you haven't run yourself over.
Anyway, yeah, I should put my baseball cap on backwards and things like that, and
I love it when you do that.
yeah, It's a normal look for me
Yeah,
when
it's
I'm.
extraordinary that East Ham comes out top for children who are in receipt of free school meals performance
Yeah.
in the
The,
GCSEs.
it is extraordinary, and it's there. I there's some facts here. Um, Free school meal pupils in East Ham are 30 percentage points more likely to achieve GCSE grade 5 in English and maths compared to those in Newcastle upon Tyne Central and West. It was done by constituencies, as I said.
30%
It's
more likely. That's
There's an
that's
interactive
extraordinary.
map that you can look up your own area, your own constituency, and have a look how well free school meal pupils are doing in that area. So we'll
Yeah.
link to that as well.
I had a little play with that earlier, Martin, and one of the areas that comes up pretty well in Birmingham is Sutton Coldfield, which has a reputation in Birmingham as being relatively affluent, and so free school meals students doing very well there is quite an interesting one. And interestingly, to link back to where we are, it's one of the places that Eman RTM goes to find out whether people in Sutton are smarter than everywhere else. Spoiler, not so much. But you were interested in the comparison between East Ham and Orpington.
Yeah, it's because London comes up top for well, the top
All
20
the top
constituencies are all
20
in London.
areas are in London, aren't they?
In the top 55, it's all London apart from bar a few. I mean, I can't
Yeah.
eight. I think
Yeah, a
it's eight.
couple of, it's two or three in Birmingham. Yeah.
And there's Orpington, which is a leafy borough, just Bromley. It's
Mhm.
probably the leafiest. It's very much commuter
Is it
territory.
Kent?
It's Kent borders. It's not. I
Yeah,
think it's
yeah.
because I think it's
Not
Bromley.
quite.
So, but it would be Kent in the old days. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, that area doesn't do so well for free school meals students, so they don't
yeah.
don't perform well. So where there are you,
Is it part of the grammar school kind of massive?
well, yes, of course you do, and that's interesting when you get into Kent and also look at
Mm.
Lincolnshire and other areas which I expect Buckinghamshire as well, of course.
Bucks,
The,
yeah.
these areas which are heavily grammar school, not secondary mods, but
Yeah, yeah,
you know some are. Uh,
yeah. They
the, the,
feel like
the,
that to them.
yeah,
They talk about themselves that way,
it's
don't
well worth looking at that and seeing what you can derive from that. But it's extraordinary um, to look at how poor people aren't doing so badly because of their poverty in certain areas.
they? Yeah. But
And we're
also,
talking about even getting to degree level. If
yeah,
you go to East Ham, you're 3 times more likely to obtain a degree by age 22 than
yeah,
again those
extraordinary.
in other areas.
Yeah, and you're likely to earn about £7,000 more per year
In
than
East Ham,
people.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
really. I mean, really interesting. Very, very. So clearly, like what? Well, okay. So the short answer there is that geography seems to really matter. What might it be, Martin, about the educational experience that young people have in an area like East Ham? Are the schools just better?
it could be. I wouldn't knock that idea. There was a big thing about education in London when I first
Mhm.
started teaching in
The
London.
London Challenge. Yeah,
Was well before then that the schools in London were you know poverty stricken. There was people just saying how what a waste of time that
yeah.
and now it's completely turned around.
It's a
Now
beacon. Yeah,
people say the London challenge, but there's so much evidence that isn't
yeah,
very easy to take from the
yeah,
London challenge to say it was because of that. There's also things about high immigration actually
yeah,
that has done a lot for aspirational
yeah.
people coming here, wanting to do well, wanting their kids to do well, pushing them,
Coming
and
over
so
here, acing our exams.
yeah, that. So there's that. There's also there was an element in the where people were moving out of the centres, so it became
Mm,
very drab. All the high streets were collapsing. All this. People moved back in, and London's a vibrant city. I mean, go back to Johnson. If you're bored of London, you're bored of life. this sort of idea. I think London
I
is
think you might have been
extraordinarily
paraphrasing that.
culturally rich. So we talk about culture as a bind. What binds people together is the variety of culture and the amount of culture available
Yeah.
on your doorstep. And I think that makes a difference. Also, the sheer numbers of free school meal students, rather than being, 10, 20, 30, or whatever, in a
Yeah.
school year, it could be higher than that, Um,
Yeah.
so
There's
perhaps
a
you're working together and not so out of place, perhaps. I don't know if that comes into it. All
no.
sorts of reasons.
It's interesting that there isn't a school in the country where children from with free school in receipt of free school meals, pupil premium children, where they outperform non-free school meals students. As far as I'm aware, there isn't a single school, but there are schools where across the country where those students from more disadvantaged backgrounds do significantly better and almost as well as their more fortunate peers. And if we'll also provide a link to an interactive map from a website called We Are in Beta, where they've identified the top 100 schools. So it might be interesting to sort of see if how many of those schools are in East Ham and how many of them are in other areas where that have been highlighted by this Sutton Trust report. See if there's any crossover.
They make recommendations. They
Yeah, they
talk
do.
about early education access.
Sure
Uh,
start.
uh, yeah, which
Yeah,
was, which my daughter was a beneficiary of back in the day. It'll be good to see that. It's a shame that was taken away from people. I think it should be
yeah.
expanded. It should be expanded.
There was an
Um,
article in the FT this week that you sent me about Sure Start.
yes, yes, yes.
It was behind a paywall, so I didn't read it.
Okay, okay. I got free access to that for some reason.
Mm,
Anyway,
okay.
had I known, I would now do a summary of it, but I can't remember it. But
Okay. Well, okay. We can also send a link to that for people that can be bothered to pay for a subscription to the FT.
or have a free
Then
link. They
or have a
expand
free.
free school meal eligibility to all children on universal credit, which would change their
Yeah,
free school meal boundaries, of course. So that would
it
affect their
would.
next report, should
It
that come
would.
in. Um,
Yeah, that's an
Fairer
expensive
school
one.
admissions. I think that
Yeah, and that's going to definitely have an impact, greater impact in some areas than others.
targeted
What are the
interventions,
specifics of that?
tutoring in all schools
Yeah,
available
we've
for
talked
those who
about
need it.
tutoring before, haven't we?
Hmm.
Yeah, and obviously, I think it was another Sutton Trust report, wasn't it, that said that looked at the percentage of children who are getting tutored.
Yeah.
But Sure Start sounds like a no-brainer. I think pretty much everybody, apart from Michael Gove, seemed to be a fan of Sure Start. I think one of the criticisms levelled against Sure Start was that people would say there was no longitudinal evidence that going to Sure Start then had, that if you went to Sure Start, that you would expect to see it paying off years and years and years later. And I think the response to that, or a response to that, is that if you go to Sure Start, you get the benefit while you are there. If then it stops, you stop getting the benefits. To think to think that the benefit should persist would be similar to saying, well, I went to the gym 10 years ago and I'm expecting now to still be fit as a result of those gym
Well,
visits.
you're suggesting, therefore, that the knowledge you learn when you're younger doesn't begat knowledge later, if you like. That there's no previous knowledge, prior knowledge doesn't matter, is almost what you're saying there.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying
No, but
that
you're implying it.
I'm not even implying it, Martin. I'm saying that getting cognitive benefits might be more similar to getting other kinds of benefits, like physical benefits, that we need to continue that process and not just cut it
Right, you
off.
don't stop it. But to say that Sure Start follows, nothing follows Sure Start. I mean, obviously things follow Sure Start because you go into other schooling, etc., etc. They also
Yeah,
talk about nutrition.
yeah,
again, when you're younger,
yeah,
is quite important.
yeah, yeah.
So you
And I
can
think,
build on these things.
we saw during COVID, didn't we? With campaigns from people like Marcus Rashford, that children in receipt of preschool meals really needed to get those meals in holidays as well.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, okay, so it's a really interesting report. They sound like solidly sensible recommendations. Whether they're considered to be affordable in the current climate, who can say? But let's finish off by thinking a little bit. We mentioned at the beginning of the show, Martin, thinking about breadth or depth. Are we teaching too much, too thinly, or not enough of the right things? What do you think?
I think it's almost a question that could be so large that it's probably very difficult to answer in a short nugget right at the end of this show. So perhaps we ought to do a show on breadth and depth at some point,
Okay.
because I do think it's a big issue for me. I think we don't teach enough in breadth,
Yeah.
and we do tend to see things. What was the curriculum gurus were saying a couple of years ago about depth? There's fewer things. You should learn
Yeah.
fewer things in greater depth. I do
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
agree with that.
I don't think so. No, that doesn't sound right to me. I think we agree on this, Martin. I'm very much of the opinion that breadth enables depth.
Hmm.
That if you don't, I remember you telling me a story. Maybe you want to repeat it now, about your daughter doing a project at school on climate change.
Oh yeah, and she didn't understand at that time. She didn't understand what climate was.
Yeah.
So I
So they
asked her a question.
rushed.
What's climate? She said, I don't know, but it's changing. It's changing. Polar
Yeah.
bears. Polar bears are dying.
Right. Yeah. But we've no idea why, because we don't know what climate is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so having sufficient depth to be able to look at things in having sufficient breadth of knowledge in order to then investigate things in depth seems
Yeah,
to be
and
an
also
important
because if you have breadth of knowledge, new knowledge comes along, it's got something to connect to in your prior knowledge, if you like.
intellectual Velcro, as E.D. Hirsch refers to it.
There you go.
Yeah.
And we've done that. That's beautiful. We've come all the way round back to
We've
E.D.
come all the way
Hirsch.
around. It's like we planned it, Martin.
It's almost like that. We've got
Yeah.
a new episode coming out at the weekend, which is a bank holiday bonus for half term,
On AI.
on AI, and perhaps we'll get AI to do it.
Let's do that. Yeah. So we're going to be replaced by robots in the next, in between episodes. Will you be able to tell? Is the question.
And it's
But we
amazing
have.
what they can do these days.
It's a triumph of engineering.
Anyway,
Anyway, Martin,
thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.
thanks for
Like and
wasting your
subscribe
time.
and do all that. Till next time.
Bye bye.